Hello, friends. Today is my favorite topic, and that is feathers. I'm going to show you how to start off with your feathers if you don't know yet and get you going on some basic feathers. So let's get cracking. What you need to understand, first of all, is that our feather fronds has a very specific shape to start off with, and that is a paisley shape. And you're going to take a piece of paper and you're going to practice drawing this shape and do it both sides, left and right, up and down. Okay, I'm going to clear the page, clear our layer, and let's look at this again. This shape has no straight lines. In other words, it's not half a curve with a bit of a straight and then going into a half circle with a straight line, a bend and a hook, and then coming back to our spine. It is a shape that's continuously curved, and when you continue with that line, look what happens. No straight lines. Okay, super important for you to start off with your feathers in the right position. Any feather has a spine. Sometimes we draw the spine, sometimes we stitch the spine, sometimes we only mark the spine, but eventually after stitching your feathers, a spine will form. Your choice will be in, do you want to see the stitched spine, or do you want to see a thread build up where things just get together? So I'm going to do again, just a shallow angle and just a marked spine, and you'll see how that shapes. So I typically do my feathers one side up, I stop and break thread, or I stitch my way down the spine and then do the other side. So we're going to start by adding our fronds. Okay, there's my first paisley. I'm going to travel up the spine a little bit and do the next paisley. Travel up the spine, travel up the spine. Now when I'm reaching the top, I'll break thread there and restart at the bottom. And you don't have to stitch all the way into the spine. You can stop short if you want. It's very much play. And look what happens. Your very first basic feather. Now if you don't stitch the spine, you only mark it, look what will happen. Oh boy, I'm going into my bump back method, which I don't want to show to you now. First of all, let's just start with our basic feather. And now you have a choice. You can either stitch it down, or I'm going to stop there, restart at the bottom. And those feathers will start forming a spine on its own. And you'll see it looks fairly similar. What you also can do is pull those fronds apart even more. Get back to my layer. If I'm just going to mark the spine, and I can now stitch my fronds, and I don't really touch that spine. So I'm opening up the end of each of the paisley shapes. I'm barely touching the spine, and I'm creating a very loose, informal feather. And again, in this instance, I would actually stitch down, but just next to that marked line. And now continue by adding your loose, open fronds. It's an easier method to do, especially if you start out, because there's no overstitching and no lines sitting on top of each other, no traveling. But now let's say you do want to get a more formal feather look, and that involves traveling. I'm going to stitch my spine. Well, let's just go a little bit straighter, not as curved, because sometimes the deeper curves can be a problem. And I'm actually going to end it off with a frond. And I'll break thread and restart at the bottom. And now I'm going to do my paisleys. And I'm going to travel on the back of the first one to do the next one. Travel on the back of the first one to go over to the next one. Take a piece of paper and draw. Draw, 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 draw. It's the only way that you learn how to do feathers is practice. And it's best for our morale to practice on paper where we don't have to unpick and where we can figure out tricky areas like what's happening here. Now, and automatically I'm going into the bump back method. Let's see, travel on the back. There we go. Travel on the back. It will become easier the more you draw it, and then the more you quilt it. But remember, our frond has no straight lines. We're not creating shelves. Let's go to that one. We're not creating shelves where we have a spine and now we have a frond that does that. You know what happens with shelves? It gathers dust with all sorts of stuff that you put on there. Okay, we don't want shelves that forms these cornered returns to our spine. We want, if we have our spine, our frond to return nicely, evenly, with no straight lines into the spine. That's your very basic feather frond shape. And then from here, we go more complicated, more detailed, more decorative. Next up, Claire will show you how to do feathers with stencils. And we also have later in the month her favorite feather, my favorite feather. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Now, once you've practiced your frond shape, I can give you another tip when you want to do some feathers in a straight section, in a sashing or in a border, where a feather runs on a straight spine, to start you off with. Give yourself the blue lines, that's indicating my border. The grey line I'm showing as intervals. And this is going to be your guidelines that you draw with your chalk pen or your blue pen. And you need to just practice and determine how fat and wide and how long you want your feathers to be. So I have this space indicated. And then what I do is by drawing, I determine what I want my feather to look like. And I'm going to add extra markings. I'm going to add a little halfway notch, just as a guide that will help me place my feathers and make sure that they all look the same. When we do a curved spine feather, you can hide a lot. But when you do feathers in a straight line with a straight spine, everything is visible. So by adding these spaces, adding these guidelines, you can help space out your feather. So I would say at the halfway mark is where I'll be starting my frond and letting it fill that space, but then returning to the start of that block. So we have two focal points I'm looking at. I'm traveling on the spine until I get that halfway mark. Now I know I can come out, make my frond, return to the start of that block. That's if I want this look where the feathers sit apart. And I'm using guidelines and spacing to help me get my feathers more or less the same shape and size. Not like that wild one. Fortunately, I can erase. Let's try and do it better. Return to the start of that block. And use guidelines to help space your feather fronds. We close that up. Let's do another style where we do traveling on one another. So that always determines, the very first feather kind of determines the direction everything else goes in. So again, I'm just going to add my little halfway notches so that I have additional guidelines to aim for. I'm going to make my first frond, and you'll see I always make mine from the bottom up. I'm traveling on the previous one, fill that space, and again I'm aiming for the start of that block. First one, fill that space, aim for the start of that block. So these feathers are fairly fat, and you can make your spacing lines as close or far apart as you prefer. And I'm just joining my spine at the same mark, and that will give me a feather that's more or less the same size and spaced throughout. And I know this is something that I struggled with initially on a straight line, is trying to get them all the same size. They end up at this angle, and then the last one ends up lying completely flat on its back. So I hope this little tip helps you. Go and draw, go and practice, and then get onto some fabric. Until next week.